Hi, I'm Nikhila Natarajan in New York. I'm joined by Dr. Alexis and Mihir Sharma. Alexis is in New York. She's the geopolitical investing practice lead at PwC US. And Mihir is senior fellow at Observer Research Foundation and columnist at Bloomberg Opinion. We're meeting on a day when initial unemployment claims have hit the highest mark in US history. The COVID-19 death toll here has crossed the 1,000 mark, and health workers are describing apocalyptic scenes. All talk of a V-shaped recovery has been wiped out. Alexis, I'll start with you. Since you lead geopolitical investing, what's your rubric to think through an unprecedented situation like this?
I think many are calling this the once in a lifetime pandemic, and what I would say is that it is indeed unprecedented, um, and unprecedented in a number of ways. I think one of them is when we look at the spike in jobless claims in U.S., the largest in history, as you mentioned. We think about the hit to the real economy that this is causing. So going back to the great financial crisis. Um, Financial activities in the US by sector employed 5% of the working force. And now you're looking at immediately probably 20% of the working force being knocked out in terms of retail and hospitality. Unprecedented also as we think about the ripple effects and ricocheting across the world. We have reached an all-time high in air passenger traffic prior to the coronavirus outbreak. And so we have mobility at a place at which it's never been. We are global people. We also have finance in an interconnected way. Some of us came to know that all too well during the great financial crisis than we've ever had. Many emerging market countries are euro or dollar borrowers in both the sovereign space and the corporate space. And in terms of economic prosperity, not only are cheaper imports being helpful to stimulate growth from emerging and frontier markets, but demand obviously has been supported in advanced economies. We're all moving to services-oriented economies, and again, those activities have been brought to a standstill across much of the world.
Meher, I'd like to bring you in here. The curve in every city, every state, every country is different right now. And this pandemic is gaining on vulnerable countries that join the battle with far fewer weapons than, say, China. So, what's the prognosis for Asian markets then?
Well, I think that it's not about the markets at this point because I think we have to recognize that for much of Asia and for the emerging world, just dealing with the consequences of the pandemic it's qualitatively different than how it is for much of the developed world. The developed world, by and large, we can say has, of course, health systems that may be inadequate to this task, but are not overstretched already. There is a sense in which developed world governments can in fact borrow more easily than many emerging world governments. But most importantly, I think emerging world economies are they are in many cases much more dependent upon informality, which means that you don't have large enterprises that can sort of determine, can serve as a channel for money to get to workers. You don't always have people who have any resources of any kind. So there are people who are essentially earning a daily wage, and therefore, if they lose out on their daily wage for the length of time that, for example, quarantine procedures would require, they may drip below the poverty line, or in fact, in some cases, get close to below the subsistence line. So these are qualitatively different problems, I think, that the emerging world has to deal with, and we don't have a handle exactly on how they can be solved.
But Meher, since you talked about the informal market, I'll just follow up there. Direct cash transfers are how governments are matching the moment.
Well, I think direct cash transfers are one way that you can try to get money out to many people. But the truth here is that even our existing transfer mechanisms in places like India, for example, have very large holes in them. People we recognized in 2016 when we needed transfers, where we thought we might need transfers to deal with the fallout of a big policy decision, which was the demonetization of the Indian currency. We recognized that it wasn't necessarily that easy to get money out quickly because even if you had open bank accounts for a large number of people, not everybody had them. The people who needed the money the most may not have had the bank accounts. A lot of people didn't know how to use the bank accounts. They were there in name only, etc., etc., etc. And finally, I think I read a very good line from someone recently, which said that essentially economists have this term called helicopter money, and we think that cash transfers are helicopter money in the sense that the government is metaphorically throwing money out of a helicopter at the people. But in India, we might get to the stage where you actually literally have to throw money out of helicopters at people as a relief package.
Well, Alexis, you spoke with Politico recently about culturally specific support measures. What are the ones you are following closely?
Thank you. I think starting with the European responses, where I spend a lot of my time looking at, Germany has the Kurzarbeit, a policy of handing money directly to workers or to companies for specifically for workers. So rather than adding to balance sheets, it's really designed to help and support employees. So help them to be furloughed, but not to be formally laid off. And I think that's going to be absolutely crucial because if we think about economic growth in advanced economies, north of 55% of that in most advanced economies comes from consumption. And if you think about the consumption power of a worker over the longer term, it's much more healthy to support the worker in their job and to keep that sustainable employment than just a quick cash transfer. I think obviously the cash transfers are valid and wonderful for lower income families where there is already a job cut that we've seen obviously colossally in colossal numbers today. So that example from Germany, I think, is fantastic. We also see evidence of that being quick to be able to implement, that it was able to save hundreds of thousands of workers in Germany during the great financial crisis. So I think we are seeing some countries in Europe where there's more complexity, more bureaucratic complexity, which is, I think, probably a bit cumbersome at this moment in time. Also thinking about, I'm sitting in New York, I've lived a lot of my life in London, thinking about the small to medium enterprises here that have already had to start shuttering their businesses in terms of restaurants, retail, hospitality. Crucially, a lot of those have faced unaffordable rents in terms of the sky-high commercial rent in London and retail rents in London and in New York. And so I think the government's ability to step in to be able to support or suspend mortgage payments, I've seen that come out obviously in London. I think that's going to be very important for small to medium enterprises. Spain also has taken dramatic moves to be able to step in to support their workers in a way that Germany has as well, being led by a socialist prime minister. And then coming to Asia, I think we've seen strong moves from Malaysia and Singapore to be able to support the tourism sectors, which of course are main driver of economic growth in both economies. So to be able to suspend tax payments, I think is fantastic. Korea also taking measures to be able to support small shops, thinking about also highly consumption-driven economy in Korea. So I think these measures are fantastic. And of course, coming to India, what we've seen come in overnight is the ability to help people to access food and families to access food, which is obviously going to be critical.
I think that we have to recognize that there are about three sets of economies in Asia which we need to be thinking about here. One is the sort of northwestern, fairly developed economies, in which for the purpose of this, I'll sort of include northwestern coastal China, where you do have some state resources to throw at the problem. In fact, considerable state resources to throw at the problem, and fairly advanced sort of social and health infrastructure that can help you deal with this. Um, then, so there you will have, for example, the excellent. I think South Korea remains the model in terms of not only what its health response has been, but in terms of how it has been able to correctly identify and then target those sectors, enterprises, and individuals that are most immediately in need of support. Um, the issue is that then you have another set of economies, which is, let us say, the emerging manufacturing hub of Southeast Asia, ASEAN, and so on and so forth. There you have a combination of slightly lower capacity governments, both in terms of resources and implementation capacity. Um, but you also have the sense that they are just stepping up a ladder in global supply chains, and then you are now perturbing those supply chains, you're disrupting those supply chains in an unprecedented manner. We don't know whether the outcome of this disturbance to the sort of supply chain status quo is going to be positive or negative for Southeast Asia. People can take two lessons. One, they can start talking about reshoring and how globalization was bad completely, or they can start saying globalization that was dependent essentially on one supplier and did not have built-in ability to move supply chains around at short notice, that was the problem. If they take lesson two, then maybe Southeast Asia and so on will benefit. If they take lesson one, then I think it's fair to say nobody in Asia will benefit. And finally, you have those emerging economies that are, I think, on the lowest step of this sort of ladder of globalization, which is maybe countries like India and to an extent Bangladesh. So I think Bangladesh is doing better than India at this point. Um, and that is there you have to think about essentially what the impact is going to be on global finance. What are the financial flows that are going to be cut off to India? We've seen enormous amounts of selling by foreign institutional investors of both equity and debt in the Indian markets recently. This vastly reduces the resources available to both the government and to Indian private sector to recover from the economy because we'll essentially be dependent upon our own resources going forward. So there are multiple different ways in which I think the Asian response will have to be calibrated going forward.
Great. Alexis, let's dial forward a little bit. You raise 4 questions in your blog, and I'm just going to pick like one theme. So, for those who really have dollar strength and liquidity, when markets return and recover, what should they be long on?
Yeah, so I think what we're talking about is the upside. So once the health crisis subsides, God willing, across different economies, that you will start to see organizations that are currently focused on addressing the health crisis for their own employees, as well as potential liquidity crunches in terms of access to funding, cash flow. You will start to see some of the world's largest institutional investors probably look to the alternative asset space with attraction in some of these developing Asian economies and emerging market economies. So, as Mihir mentioned, the capital outflows that we've seen, and the IIF has published their latest figures, are actually unprecedented out of emerging markets in the liquid markets, obviously leading to a sharp rise in sovereign borrowing costs, spike in the dollar, obviously leading to much sharper borrowing costs and a crunch to liquidity for some of the non-financial corporates. But in the alternative asset space, the trick is when you are a sovereign or a pension fund to buy low to sell high, and hopefully to find an enterprise that has a steady stream of income. So I think probably leading to maybe Q3, you will start to see people look at some markets of opportunity. So the question becomes, as Mihir mentioned, is, are we writing off the integration of developing Asian countries with high productivity out of global supply chains and also rich income Asian countries? What I would say is what I've seen is some economists in Europe and North America calling for a relocalization of medical supply chain, pharmaceutical. I think some are really concerned about not even a geopolitical tit for tat or not, no storm and drang, but actually just when an economy goes to a standstill, can we actually access the critical medical supplies? We're seeing a lot of retail companies, in the US and Europe stand in to be able to address critical shortfalls. But what I would say is, if we agree with Bill Gates that this is a once in a lifetime pandemic, and others have said that, then the relocalization is premature, and thinking about the ability to access very, very high levels of productivity, young demographics, lower cost of inputs in terms of raw materials across Asia and parts of Latin America, I would think are going to remain very, very compelling. So here's where I think you also have to stand in. If I was an institutional investor, I would be looking very clearly at, okay, a lot of countries will probably have to have investment downgrades in terms of their credit, just given the situation and the need to address the fiscal situation and the health crisis. What I would say, though, is over the longer term, this will probably flush out some of the economies that have been healthier in terms of their borrowing and fiscal stimulus side of things. So here you're thinking about economies that have been in surplus or near surplus, those that have implemented macroprudential measures since the great financial crisis and going back to the Asian flu in the late 1990s. So I think that macroprudential measures will come in handy once the dust eventually settles from the pandemic.
Mihir, any closing thoughts, or do you want to respond to some of Alex's comments?
No, I think that she's made some excellent points, in particular about sort of institutional investors, hopefully rummaging through what they see here and picking up what they think they need to hold on to for their typically much longer tenures. But I think that I'll just sort of talk briefly, perhaps, about something that Alexis gestured to, which is this sort of geopolitical Sturm und Drang, as she put it. And here, I think we have to figure out that there is some. I mean, there was already a sort of reorientation of one sort going on, and we have to try and work through what the implications of this particular crisis and this reorientation will be. Um, it appears to some of us in the global south that one particular worry is that if there is a propaganda war over the reaction to the pandemic, almost ironically and unexpectedly, it is possible that Beijing will win it. And Beijing will win it because it's the only one fighting it, right? So today, if in India you hear the United States will wish to buy companies that behave a particular way, that intellectual property rights might come in the way of being able to uh, um, access the drugs that you want. While meanwhile, the Chinese government is offering to send, um, you know, tens of thousands of masks, maybe of not very good quality, but the offer is maybe what counts. Um, this is going to maybe reorient how people have been thinking about their future in the larger geopolitical scheme of things. And I think that is something that we have to keep in mind. There is an economic angle to this in particular, which is that this is the moment at which the multilateral organizations that have been associated with the Bretton Woods consensus and with the current existing liberal order have to really earn their pay, right? Because if we are talking about essentially war economies and reconstruction economies in many parts of the emerging world, well, that is what the World Bank and the IMF were set up for. So even if the US can spare $2 trillion to fix its own economy and cannot spare even a fraction of that to work on ensuring that the multilateral organizations that keep the liberal order going have the resources they need to address the needs of emerging economies, then I think people will start to ask very, very tough questions about the future. And I think that is the way in which we have to look at the geoeconomics of the future and the decisions that are being made today in the capitals of the West very, very carefully.
Yeah, totally. I mean, I agree. It's a kind of crazy time. That point that you make, Mihir, is well taken. Alexis, any closing thoughts?
Yeah, crucially, thank you. Just to come back off, dovetail what Mihir was saying. I mean, there's the other aspect of the private sector stepping in. You know, certain individuals from China sending millions of masks and, the private sector stepping in across the board. And I think that's a fantastic opportunity because unfortunately, while sometimes our cooperation has been at the behest of individuals or groups of individuals that would not like to have cooperation, I think going forward, that is where the private sector has muscle. So whether or not it's institutional investors, whether or not it's some of the corporations that get, between 40 to north of 40% of their revenue from emerging market economies, from sales in these economies, I think that's going to be critical to be able to see the ways in which they can step in for a social good.
Great. Thank you so much, both of you, and stay well.